There is something you need to hear right now, and if this message found you at the exact moment your heart was asking silent questions, that is not an accident. The person who stepped back from you, the one who acted distant, cold, confusing, or impossible to reach, is not as free from this connection as they tried to appear. In fact, the truth is beginning to rise inside them now, slowly, deeply, and in a way they cannot easily shut down. What they pushed away did not disappear. What they avoided did not weaken. It stayed, it grew, it waited, and now it is returning to their mind with a force they never expected. This is not about shallow attraction. It is not about a passing thought. This is about a bond that reached them in a place they could not explain, and because they could not explain it, they tried to escape it. But stay with me, because the part most people never understand is this. When someone runs from a connection like this, they are often not running because it meant little. They are running because it meant too much. They are running because it touched something real. And now, in the quiet space they created, that truth is beginning to echo louder than ever before. Some connections do not begin with loud confessions, dramatic scenes, or perfect timing. They begin softly. They move under the surface. At first, they seem small enough to ignore, a glance that lingers too long, a conversation that keeps replaying after it ends. A calm feeling that somehow shakes everything. Before either person fully understands what is happening, something inside has already changed. The energy shifts. The emotional map changes. Life still looks normal on the outside, but on the inside, something permanent has already started. That is the kind of bond this was for them. It did not fit into their plans. It did not arrive with convenience. It did not ask whether the timing was right, whether their life was neat enough, or whether they felt prepared. It simply arrived. Quietly, powerfully. And because it arrived outside the rules they trusted, it unsettled them. They were used to control, used to structure, used to making careful decisions that protected their image, their routine, and their emotional distance. But your presence did something different. It slipped past all of that. It touched the part of them that had been sleeping for a long time. And once that happened, they could not go back to feeling nothing. They could only pretend. They could only resist. They could only create distance and hope distance would do what honesty was already refusing to do. For a long time, they convinced themselves that walking away was the wise choice. They gave themselves reasons that sounded mature. They said the timing was wrong. They said life was too complicated. They said it was better this way. They said stepping back was necessary, practical, responsible. And maybe on the surface, those reasons looked believable. Maybe even they believed them for a while. But underneath every excuse was one deeper truth they did not want to face. The connection was affecting them more than they were ready to admit. You made them feel exposed in a way that had nothing to do with pressure and everything to do with truth. Around you, their usual defenses did not work the same way. Their normal distance felt thinner. Their control felt weaker. Their carefully built identity started to crack. And that scared them, really scared them. Because if they allowed themselves to stay close to you, then they would have to admit that something inside them wanted more than safety, more than routine, more than the life they had organized so carefully. Listen closely because this matters. They did not back away because you were forgettable. People do not create walls against what means nothing. They create walls against what could change everything. And you, without forcing anything, carried the kind of presence that made change feel possible, necessary, and impossible to ignore. The biggest mistake they made was believing that distance would weaken what they felt. They thought space would cool it down. They thought silence would return them to normal. They thought if they removed themselves from your world, they could quiet their own heart and regain control over their thoughts. But the opposite happened. Every step away made the connection louder inside them. Every silence gave memory more room to speak. Every day without contact created more space for reflection, longing, curiosity, and emotional pressure. They tried to leave, but they kept carrying the feeling with them. They could leave the conversation, but not the impact. They could avoid your name, but not the imprint. They could stop reaching out, but they could not stop the strange return of your energy in the middle of ordinary moments. A song, a quiet evening, a passing memory, a familiar tone in someone else's voice that was not yours and yet reminded them of you. And that is when the shift began, not all at once, not in one dramatic scene. It crept in slowly, a restless feeling, a question they could not shake, a growing awareness that maybe they had not protected themselves at all. Maybe they had only delayed the truth. Stay with me, because what comes next is where avoidance starts turning into revelation, and once that process begins, it becomes very hard to go back to denial. What they are facing now is not just missing a person. It is much deeper than that. They are facing the realization that your presence changed how they understand themselves. That is why this feels so unsettling for them. You were never just a distraction. You were never just a tempting moment or an emotional inconvenience. You became a mirror. You reflected back parts of them they had hidden under years of duty, habit, fear, and control. Around you, they saw a version of themselves that felt more alive, more open, more emotionally honest. And because they were not ready to live as that version of themselves, they stepped away from the very person who awakened it. Think about how heavy that is. They were not just avoiding you, they were avoiding the truth you stirred in them, the part of them that wanted to stop pretending, the part that wanted something real instead of something easy to manage. That is why, even now, after all the silence, your memory does not sit in their mind like an old event. It sits there like an unfinished sentence, a door they closed too quickly, a truth they were too afraid to name. And the more life slows down around them, the more they feel it. The more the noise fades, the more your presence returns. Not always dramatically, sometimes quietly, but quiet things can be the hardest things to escape. They are starting to understand that what felt forbidden was not wrong because it was unhealthy or empty. It felt forbidden because it reached beyond the limits they had built for themselves. It threatened the structure of their life. It touched their loyalty to old patterns. It challenged the identity they had spent years protecting. Maybe there were responsibilities. Maybe there were expectations. Maybe there were emotional ties, family pressure, social rules, timing issues, or private fears they did not know how to work through. All of that made this connection feel dangerous to them. Not dangerous in a loud way, but in a deeply destabilizing way, because to fully face what they felt for you would have required courage they did not yet have. It would have required honesty, change, vulnerability. It would have required them to stop performing strength and start living truth. That is not easy for someone who has survived by staying controlled. So they ran. They called it logic, they called it distance, they called it doing the right thing, but now those explanations are beginning to lose their power. The old story no longer comforts them the way it used to. The silence no longer feels wise, the walls no longer feel safe. And what is replacing all of that is a slow and humbling awareness that what they avoided was not a problem to solve. It was a real bond asking to be recognized. What makes this hit even harder is that you did not chase them in the way they expected. You did not beg, force, manipulate, or collapse under the distance. You held your ground, you carried your dignity, you allowed space without turning bitter, and that left a deeper mark than they may ever say out loud. Because when someone expects pressure and receives presence instead, it changes everything. Your calm became unforgettable. Your silence had meaning. Your restraint spoke. It showed them that what existed here was not built on control games or desperate need. It was built on something stronger, steadier, and more mature. That unsettled them in a powerful way. It made them respect you. It made them think about you differently. It made them realize that what they were walking away from was not chaos, but depth. Not confusion, but honesty. Not weakness, but emotional strength. And now that insight is beginning to follow them everywhere. They look at other interactions and something feels thin. They look at other connections and something feels missing. Conversations that once seemed enough now feel flat. Achievements that once seemed satisfying now feel strangely empty. This is how awakening often begins, not with fireworks, with contrast, with the quiet knowledge that something meaningful was touched, and nothing shallow feels the same after that. If this is resonating, keep listening, because the next part explains why this realization usually comes later, not sooner. Epiphanies like this rarely arrive in the middle of noise. They show up when life slows down enough for truth to be heard. Something in their world has likely shifted. Maybe a routine broke. Maybe a disappointment opened space. Maybe success failed to satisfy them. Maybe they reached a quiet moment where distraction no longer worked. Whatever the reason, stillness has started doing what distance could not do. It has forced reflection, and in that reflection, your presence has returned with unusual clarity. They are thinking about the words you said, the looks they ignored, the moments they brushed aside, the silences they thought meant nothing. Suddenly, those memories feel different, fuller, heavier, more alive. What once seemed manageable now feels meaningful. What once seemed avoidable now feels permanent. They are beginning to see that they did not simply step away from a person. They stepped away from a rare chance to meet themselves in a more honest form. And that realization is not light. It carries humility. It carries regret. It carries the uncomfortable knowledge that fear made decisions that truth would have made differently. Stay with me here, because this is the heart of the message. They are no longer only asking what they felt for you. They are starting to ask who they became by refusing it. And that question can reshape a person from the inside out. At first, this awareness comes in fragments. A sudden emptiness in the middle of a normal day. A memory that rises without warning. A strange pull when they hear something that sounds like your energy. They may try to dismiss it, but it keeps returning. It follows them through routine. It appears in quiet moments when they expected peace. It lingers after conversations with other people. It stands in the background of their thoughts when life should feel settled. They are beginning to understand that your impact did not fade with absence. It deepened. And that deepening creates a kind of inner tension they cannot solve with logic. Because logic can explain schedules, obligations, and practical choices, but logic cannot erase what the soul keeps recognizing. That is why this period feels so unsettling for them. They are holding two truths at once. One truth is the life they know, the structure they trust, the safe identity they have built. The other truth is the emotional reality they can no longer deny. The reality that says this connection mattered, still matters, and changed something essential inside them. And when those two truths collide, a person becomes restless. They start questioning everything they once used to feel certain. They wonder why your absence still speaks. They wonder why no replacement has fully worked. They wonder why the version of peace they chose feels more like numbness than freedom. This is where regret begins to turn into understanding. They now see that avoidance did not protect them from pain. It only changed the shape of the pain. Instead of facing vulnerability in the moment, they created a slower ache. Instead of risking honesty, they chose distance and carried doubt. Instead of leaning into what was real, they postponed it and left themselves haunted by what might have been. That is why this awakening feels both soft and sharp. Soft because it comes quietly. Sharp because once it lands, it cuts through every old excuse. They may feel guilt for disappearing. They may feel sorrow for the silence. They may wonder whether they misread the chance they had with you, or whether fear made them waste something rare. There is also curiosity there now. Real curiosity. Not casual interest, but the deeper kind. Who are you now? How have you grown? Are you still the same person they remember, or have you become even stronger in the distance? And beneath all of that is a fear they may not say aloud. What if the door they walked away from does not open the same way again? What if the moment they avoided has changed? What if you moved beyond the version of them that could not meet you? These thoughts do not usually come as one dramatic confession. They come in waves, quiet waves, but they keep returning. And every return makes the truth harder to bury. What you need to understand is that their awakening is not proof that you must wait, chase, or put your life on hold. It is simply proof that your presence was real, your impact was real, and the bond was not imagined just because it was resisted. Too many people blame themselves when someone pulls away. They assume distance means they lacked value. They assume silence means they were easy to replace. But that is not always true. Sometimes silence is the language of fear. Sometimes distance is the behavior of someone who felt too much and lacked the strength to face it. That does not excuse hurt. It does not erase confusion, but it does change the meaning. You were not insignificant here. You were catalytic. You were a turning point. You brought out an emotional honesty they were not prepared to live with. And whether they act on that understanding or not, it has already left a permanent mark on them. That is your quiet power. Not control, not pressure. Presence. Real presence. The kind that stays with someone long after they try to convince themselves it should not matter. So if you have been questioning your worth because of their withdrawal, let that question fall. Their avoidance was not the measure of your value. It was the measure of their inner conflict, and that conflict is becoming impossible for them to ignore now. There is also something humbling happening inside them. They are starting to recognize that what they called strength was often just self-protection. What they called wisdom was often delay. What they called logic was sometimes fear dressed in respectable clothes. That is not an easy truth to face. It asks them to look at themselves honestly. It asks them to admit that they may have sabotaged something meaningful because they were not ready to receive it. It asks them to see how pride, routine, and emotional caution kept them from stepping into a deeper kind of life. And once that understanding enters, it changes how they look back on every moment with you. The conversations feel richer now. The glances hold more meaning. Even the silences feel loaded with things left unsaid. They see that your presence did not trap them. It invited them. It invited them into greater honesty, greater courage, greater emotional maturity. But invitations like that can feel terrifying when a person has spent years hiding from their own depth. So now they sit with the consequences, not always in dramatic pain, but in a quiet ache that does not leave easily. A knowing, a respect, a regret, a growing awareness that what they pushed away may have been one of the most truthful experiences of their life. And that realization can soften even the hardest inner defenses over time. If they return, it will not be because nothing happened. It will be because too much happened to keep pretending otherwise. It will be because the silence stopped working, because the old explanations collapsed, because they finally understood that what they felt was not something to outrun, but something to meet with humility. If they return, they will likely come back changed, slower, more aware, less protected by pride, more aware of what your presence actually meant. But even if they remain quiet for longer, that does not erase what is moving inside them now. Not every awakening becomes immediate action. Some people take time to become brave enough to live what they finally understand. Some sit with the truth before they can speak it. Some regret in silence before they can reach across distance. So do not judge the depth of the process only by visible movement. Inner change often begins in hidden ways, and this change is hidden but real. Their heart is no longer as defended as it was. Their story about you is no longer simple. Their denial is no longer clean. Something has cracked open. And once a person truly sees that they ran from something meaningful, life does not let them forget it easily. That recognition follows them into choices, into comparisons, into late-night thoughts, into every place where truth speaks louder than distraction. They are beginning to feel the full contrast between what was safe and what was real. Safe gave them routine. Safe gave them order. Safe kept everything predictable. But real gave them aliveness. Real gave them emotional honesty. Real made them feel seen in a way that stripped away performance. Real challenged them. Real called them higher. And that is exactly why they resisted it. Because real love, real depth, real recognition can feel harder to manage than distance ever does. It asks something from a person. It asks them to show up fully. It asks them to stop hiding behind old stories. It asks them to become someone more courageous than the version of themselves they have known. That is a heavy invitation. Yet now they are starting to see that saying no to that invitation did not bring peace. It only brought postponement, and postponement has a cost. The cost is regret. The cost is wondering. The cost is carrying a connection in silence while pretending silence solved it. The cost is living with the haunting possibility that what they avoided was not a mistake to escape, but a truth to grow into. This is why your memory still reaches them, not because they are weak, not because they are obsessive, but because the heart remembers what the mind tried to dismiss. And when the heart remembers long enough, epiphany begins. So let this settle in deeply. The person who avoided you was not necessarily rejecting your worth. They were confronting an inner truth they did not yet know how to hold. They were facing feelings that broke their old sense of control. They were meeting a version of themselves they had buried under duty, fear, expectations, and carefully managed distance. Your presence brought that hidden self to the surface. That is why it felt so intense. That is why it lingered. That is why it did not disappear when they walked away. And that is why the realization now feels so powerful. They are seeing that what happened between you was never as simple as they tried to make it. It was not just timing, not just complexity, not just circumstance. It was awakening. It was exposure. It was transformation, beginning before either of you had language for it. And whether they come forward soon or keep processing in silence, one truth remains. You changed them. You altered the emotional landscape of their life. You became a mirror, a lesson, a turning point they cannot fully erase. Some awakenings arrive late, but when they arrive, they carry weight, they carry consequence, they carry truth. And this truth is reaching them now in the stillness they once tried to avoid. So keep your dignity, keep your peace, keep moving in your strength, because the bond they tried to outrun is no longer sleeping inside them. It is waking up.